You are listening to 60 Second Civics from the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. The men who drafted state constitutions and the U.S. Constitution were familiar with the ideas of antiquity when they thought about government. The Roman Republic, which lasted almost 500 years, was the ancient society that exercised the greatest influence on the founders. The laws of the Roman Republic established a complex system of offices in which the common people had a voice, but that also provided checks on the people's power. The Roman Republic was described as a mixed constitution because it had elements of monarchical power, aristocracy, and the rule of the common people. It fostered, and for a time achieved, political stability. Many historians during our founding era believed that of all the governments they studied, the Roman Republic had done the best job of promoting the common good, that is, doing what was best for the society as a whole. This idea of devotion to the common good became a very important feature of American representative democracy. That's all for today's episode, 60 Second Civics, where civic engagement only takes a minute. You are listening to 60 Second Civics from the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. The devotion of citizens to the common good was a central feature of the political ideas that we now call classical republicanism. Classical republicanism placed the needs of people as a community above individual liberty and self-determination. Citizens were taught that they should work together to promote the good of the country, not work for private or selfish interests. Only by working together in a common effort to promote the good of all could citizens maintain the republic and keep it free from the domination of others. The history of the Roman Republic was both an example and a warning to America's founding generation. For centuries, Roman citizens displayed their commitment to the common good. Public life required dedicated citizens and leaders willing to make personal sacrifices for the sake of the common good. However, Rome acquired a vast empire. Roman citizens' selfishness and corruption cost them their political freedom. Civil war followed, and in 48 BC, the Roman people accepted Julius Caesar, who was appointed dictator in order to impose order and stability in the aftermath of the Civil War. That's all for today's episode, 60 Second Civics, where civic engagement only takes a minute. You are listening to 60 Second Civics from the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. Three aspects of classical republicanism were particularly influential for the founding generation of Americans. First, that good government could work only in small, uniform communities. Second, that civic virtue among citizens was important. And third, that civic virtue must be learned. This type of learning was called moral education. In colonial America, small, homogeneous communities and churches assumed responsibility for instilling proper habits and practices. The founding generation believed that if individualism and self-interest were allowed to flourish unchecked, community life would suffer. Small, uniform communities that emphasized civic virtue and moral education, as the classical republics of antiquity had done, appealed to some of the founders as a means of reducing selfishness and corruption. That's all for today's episode, 60 Second Civics, where civic engagement only takes a minute. You are listening to 60 Second Civics from the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. The idea that government could work only in small, uniform communities was influential for the founding generation of Americans. Classical thinkers such as Aristotle observed that human beings are not self-sufficient and are always found living in association with one another in a form of political rule. Man is, he said, a political animal. Humans need each other. They live together both for security and in order to live well. Aristotle wrote, "He who is unable to live in society, or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself, must be either a beast or a god." Classical Republicans thought that good government is possible only in small communities, because in such communities, people are able to know and care for one another and to discern the common good. That's all for today's episode, 60 Second Civics, where civic engagement only takes a minute. You are listening to 60 Second Civics from the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. Classical Republican thinkers believed that members of a political community must be fundamentally alike. Great disparities in wealth or differences in culture, religion, or morals cause conflict among people rather than encouraging them to work together for the common good. Classical Republicans also feared the corrupting effects of luxury, making them wary of money-making and economic growth. Americans in the 18th century experienced many of the advantages of small communities and their devotion to the common good. Survival in early America depended on the ability of neighbors and townspeople to work together to overcome obstacles. Official or established religions also fostered homogeneity and a commitment to the common good as defined by that religion. That's all for today's episode. Music by Cheryl Engelhardt is provided by musicalley.com. 60 Second Civics, where civic engagement only takes a minute. You are listening to 60 Second Civics from the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. Classical Republicans emphasize the importance of the office of citizen and the duties associated with it. In most ancient societies, slaves and non-citizens did most of the manual labor, which allowed wealthier citizens to participate in civic affairs. Citizens were expected to set aside personal interests to promote the common good. Citizens also were expected to be well-informed and engaged in community affairs. Virtuous citizens, classical Republicans believed, should have the courage to do what was right even under trying circumstances. From the classical perspective, citizenship should emphasize duties, not rights. Most ancient republics did recognize what today we would call political rights, such as the right to vote, to express opinions about government, and to serve in public office. But most placed limits on the exercise of individual freedoms. For example, there was little concern about protecting an individual's privacy or freedom of conscience or religion. That's all for today's episode. 60 Second Civics, where civic engagement only takes a minute. You are listening to 60 Second Civics from the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. The founding generation of Americans admired the heroes of antiquity, such as the Roman patriot, orator, and writer Cato the Elder, and the citizen soldier Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was twice called on to serve as dictator, from 458 to 439 BC. After defending Rome, each time he voluntarily relinquished political power to resume private life as a farmer. The founders believed that such men were examples of civic virtue, and Americans should emulate them. Indeed, many admired George Washington as our Cincinnatus because he sacrificed his private pursuits to lead the nation in war and peace. He then voluntarily relinquished the presidency after 2 terms in office, though some would have made him an American monarch. Early Americans believed that Washington was an example of the civic virtue that should motivate all citizens. That's all for today's episode, 60 Second Civics, where civic engagement only takes a minute.